1. Human sacrifice. Although the most common theory about Aztec sacrifices is that they simply performed rituals dedicated to pagan gods, anthropologist Michael Harner thinks differently. Harner estimates that the Aztecs sacrificed about 20,000 people a year. People who were sacrificed were often eaten in the course of the ritual. Harner suggested that the cannibalism disguised as sacrifice was due to the lack of meat in the Aztec diet. That the Aztecs ate each other because of protein starvation is certainly not proven, but signs of cannibalism are hard to miss. 2. Slavery. Slavery in Aztec society differed from the European system and operated under different rules. The children of slaves were not automatically enslaved, and slaves were allowed to possess anything, even their own slaves. If a slave got into the temple, they were set free, and they were also set free if they managed to escape from their master and step on human excrement. If a slave tried to run away, only his master or his relatives could chase him. Slaves could even redeem their freedom. The Aztec system of slavery was unique and more similar to treaty bondage than the modern notion of slavery. 3. Polygamy. Aztec men were allowed to marry more than one wife, but there were several strict rules associated with such a relationship. The first wife a man married was considered his principal wife, and was the only one with whom he performed the wedding ceremony. The other wives were secondary, but they were officially recognized in the documents. Although the first wife was considered most important, a man was expected to treat all his wives with the same respect. The man was considered the head of the family, but women still had sufficient influence in relationships and were treated well in Aztec society. Additional wives contributed to the family's wealth and were considered a sign of high social standing, which allowed them to be highly respected in society. Divorce was allowed in some cases, but adultery on either side of the marriage was punishable by death. 4. Sale of children. The sale of one's children by the poor Aztecs was not considered unusual in their society. And it was not limited to children. The poor sometimes sold themselves into slavery. In many cases, when someone went bankrupt and saw no other way out, selling their children into slavery brought them some income, and if the child worked well and hard, they could eventually buy themselves out of slavery. Some remained slaves for most of their lives, which is not surprising since being a slave in Aztec society was not so bad. Slaves could marry, have children, and even own their own land. 5. Burial customs. We all know the stories of what happens when something is built on a former Indian burial ground, but the Aztecs did not worry when they had to build something on the graves of their ancestors. Moreover, the Aztecs quite often buried their ancestors either right under their house or at least next to it. If the deceased Aztec belonged to the upper classes, he was usually cremated. The Aztecs believed that cremation would help change the soul of the deceased warrior or ruler, and thus they would enter their version of heaven more quickly. Sometimes the Aztecs would kill a dog and bury or cremate it with the person to aid in their journey through the afterlife. 6. An advanced system of documentation. The Aztecs had their own language called nahuatl, whose alphabet was a type of pictographic writing. The knowledge of how to record information was known only among priests and specially trained scribes. The records were made on paper made of tree bark or deer skin. They usually wrote with charcoal and then colored the notes with vegetable sap and other materials. The Aztecs kept tax records, historical documents, preserved information about religious sacrifices and other ceremonies in written form, and even wrote poetry. Sometimes they collected records in improvised books, which they called codices. 7. Misnomer. The Aztecs are known to us all by that name, but they never actually called themselves that. The Westerners who coined the name Aztec most likely derived it from Aztlan, a mythical area in northern Mexico supposedly inhabited by Aztec ancestors in the 12th century. However, the Aztecs themselves called themselves Mexica, which is where the name of the country Mexico came from. 8. Afflicted by disease. Many believe that the Spaniards defeated the Aztecs with their superior military forces, but this is far from the truth. In fact, the first Spanish attacks were successfully repelled, and they had to retreat quickly. The Aztecs had a good chance to defeat the Spaniards, and in general the war was fought on a level playing field. It is safe to say that had it not been for smallpox, which the Aztecs contracted from the Europeans and which killed most of their population, including their leaders, the Aztecs would hardly have lost the war against the Spaniards. The impact of European diseases was devastating. An estimated 20 million Mexicans died in just 5 years from diseases brought by the Spaniards. 9. Mandatory schooling. Although the Aztecs placed great emphasis on the need for parents to properly educate their children themselves, they also had compulsory schooling for all children. Schools were different for boys and girls and were also divided according to the different castes of the student body. Children of the upper castes attended Calmecac school, where they were taught history, astronomy, art, and how to rule by priests. The lower caste boys attended the Cuicacali school, where they were prepared for military service. Girls were sent to separate schools, and most of their education consisted of instruction in domestic matters such as cooking and weaving. 10. Creativity. Despite the seeming savagery of the Aztecs, they were a very creative people. The Aztecs were fond of sculpture and pottery, as well as artistic painting. They developed artistic symbols that were applied to Aztec warriors as tattoos describing their achievements. They also loved poetry. The Aztecs practiced team sports. In particular, one of their most popular sports games was the Mesoamerican ball game. The game used a rubber ball, which was quite advanced for their time, and matches were played on a field called tlaxcala. The main task of the game was to throw the ball through a small stone ring, but it was a very difficult game. The ball was not supposed to fall to the ground, and players could only touch it with their heads, elbows, knees, and hips.